Welcome to my next iteration of church history. I think this is what, 11? We're in 10th century and I did one before. So the 10th century is kind of a getting ready for the big storm of the millennium. There's a number of things going on in this century. I'm actually going to be picking up stuff that's already started and talking about things that are going to happen, because as the Middle Ages, the height of Middle Ages arrives, number of things are going to be going on. The major trends here, first I want to talk about the final Christianization of Europe. We've watched evangelical movements happen over the centuries. We watched Italy, we watched France and England areas, and Germany. Really, by the 10th century, you're going to have the outer reaches. Principally, you're going to have Russia and Scandinavia convert. And we'll look at the nature of Christianity in those realms. Dynastic struggles is something that flavors the Middle Ages really all the way along. And really, if there is a dark part of the Dark Ages, it was this. On one hand, it's totally understandable to want to have a single kingdom, to have one king moving over to coalesce these individual baronies. Makes sense. The other side is that who's finally going to be the king and who's going to step down and let someone else rule, and nobody seems to ever want to. And so you have these dynastic struggles back and forth between France and England, and even to a lesser extent Spain and Italy. And that's going to flavor, really, as I see, if there's a dark side of the Dark Age, it really was these dynastic struggles. And then I'm going to touch briefly on something called the monastic revival. There's so much to cover next time. I'm going to begin covering this a little bit so that I can fit everything in, because next time, the year 1000, there's so much going on. This is actually almost a quieter century in some ways for what comes after it. Russian Christianity. Saint Cyril and Methodius brought Christianity to Russia. Story is an interesting story and a bit of a history myth. One of the things about that, before I get into that, is into the myth of itself, is that it's interesting how the Rus, or the people living in Russia, had their own little language and pantheon and such. But when they went up there, because of the fact that Constantinople, the liturgy was basically sung in Greek at that point in time, was mostly in the language. It was an older language, but kind of like we have with an older English. When they went into Russia, they were empowered to basically create, and they took the Greek alphabet and placed it on top of what Russia spoke, and you ended up with Slavonic, with a Slavonic language. If you read Greek or know any Greek, you can actually pronounce some Russian words. There are extra letters, but in general. Oh, joy. Hang on a minute. Yeah, I know. Here we are. Christianity came to Russia by an interesting twist of history and myth. The king of Rus wanted to know more about Christianity. It was getting popular in Europe. So he sent some ambassadors to Rome and to Constantinople. The ambassadors went to Rome first, not quite sure why, but they arrived during Lent, and the liturgy was simple and austere. They respected it, but they were not especially impressed. Then they went to Constantinople. The patriarch of that city told his clergy that he was going to meet the ambassadors. He stipulated that though it was Lent, they were going to celebrate the liturgy for them as if it were Easter Sunday, to show them the glory of Christianity. The ambassadors were so impressed with what they saw in Constantinople, they invited missionaries to come to Rus. When the ambassadors arrived home, they told the king of Rus what they had seen, and they are rumored to have stated, "The frontier between heaven and earth seemed to disappear. The two became one in their worship." Hence, Russia would be a Christian nation. The Russian church would resurrect many practices from the early church, what the Greeks had abandoned, which gave Russian Christianity a special character. Russian Christianity looks very much like that of Constantinople. The liturgies are very, very similar. There's been many attempts to try and keep Russia right alongside of the similar to Constantinople, but it's never really worked. They're too separated, and they're different peoples. But the worship, and we covered this before, the worship of Constantinople is very exuberant, is very ebullient. Um, the whole thing is sung. There's no silence to it at all. The music is really quite lovely. Some of it's very ethereal, and it has an oriental really feel about it. They almost a gaudiness about it that you really don't see in the West at all. And Russia, which is interesting, and I've always felt the Russians are not especially emotional people like you'd think of the Italians or the Greeks would be. But boy, oh boy, did they really love their Byzantine expression of Christianity. It really touched something in the Russian soul. Russia adopted all key concepts of Greek Christianity. What was really interesting was that Russia was vast and much of it undeveloped in comparison with mainland Europe, because Eastern monks generally established in their communities in isolated areas as opposed to in cities. Many of the hermit practices of the Desert Fathers were revived in Russia. Russian monks rekindled many monastic customs which had been lost or abandoned, and this gave Russian monasticism a special character. One of the things is that the more in continental Europe, communities would come together, an organization, the Benedictines with their abbots and these huge structures. That didn't work in Russia at all. Many of the churches were very isolated, and they would have local town churches. People who wanted to live lives, Christian lives, were often mostly isolated. And so many of these practices that were very popular in isolation in the early centuries, memorization of prayers, the various spiritualities of Anthony of the Desert, and we'll go into a couple of them in a second, really were revived in Russian Christianity and gave it a really unique flavor. Russian monks and Russian people who practiced Christianity tended to be very austere lot, and not necessarily something they did of their own choosing. The food was often very rustic or very difficult to come by, so the diets were very simple. They would oftentimes memorize prayers, and many of these practices that they read about the Desert Fathers came back, and a very austere, isolationist type Christianity was really developed by these. Many would go off on their own in their own little hermits and huts and live their own private lives with their private prayers, eating very austere meals, living very much hearkening back to the Celts or even back to the Desert Fathers. The spiritual door was something that was revived, in the idea that you knock and it shall be opened unto you. And the idea that you are standing before the door of eternity, knocking on it, and God is letting you in and taking you on a journey through the spiritual door into a spiritual world where you and God are alone in the darkness of faith, was very big in Russian spirituality. The monasteries were often very dark. Again, the architecture was kind of heavy colors and such. The royal door and going through it, and this journey, this going through the spiritual door of faith with God, just you and God by yourself, which also harkens back to some of the Old Testament prophets, was very popular with Russian spirituality. Russian confession also varied a little bit as well. Confession could either be something like we do in the church, where it's general. Rome, when you go into the box, or even before that, you could kneel down and tell him right to a priest, and he would absolve you. In Russia, you had a spiritual father, played a large part in Russian spirituality, kind of like in the Desert Fathers, where you had the venerable father. Give me a word, Abbot. Come, Abba, give me a word. You'd only confess to your spiritual father, who would guide you. So you had to go to a spiritual father. What's interesting about this is that not all spiritual fathers were priests. And it did happen that you would go to confession to your spiritual father, and he would give you advice, and then you'd go to your priest to be absolved, and you would say, Abba so-and-so sent me, and he would absolve you of your sins. But wouldn't necessarily hear the confession. It's an interesting piece that developed, which was from the Desert Fathers, and developed again in Russian spirituality. The honor of the dead in Christ. There's a great deal of respect for and honoring of the dead, gathering up the bones. You had a huge cult of those who had gone before and keeping their memory and praying to them, very, very strong in Russian. And again, because you have these smaller catacomb places, or these places that would there was a lot of dead around. You had people who had these necropolises, and you see some of the artwork there. They had the time to do this, to make, and there's some beautiful, beautiful necropolis type artwork that comes out of Russia. The Wanderer. We saw this with Brendan the Navigator. We saw this a lot with the Celts. The idea of the spiritual voyage, the idea of God taking you along and guiding your soul, and the adventures you'd have, and people that you would meet would be part of your growth in Christ. Each person that you meet, God sent your way to teach you something about yourself. And this comes back in Russian spirituality in a very, very large way, because of the fact that these men would live in very, very isolated areas, eat very, very modest food, say their prayers, but then they would go and they'd wander to the nearby village, or they'd wander around, and when they wandered, they would show up. The Russian people loved welcoming religious men and women, mostly men. Women didn't wander that much, but they would welcome them in, they'd feed them, and they would talk, and they'd talk spiritual. So this idea of this wandering holy man, which had been utterly lost from the landscape of most of Europe at this point in time, really returns in Russia. You have these people, and interestingly enough, the dress, you can see various. You also had the guy on the left was probably a priest. We don't know. Monks, generally speaking, weren't. And they would wander around from place to place, and trusting in God to feed them, trusting in God to guide them, and praying. And it was this adventure they would go on, again, like Brendan the Navigator, who went along, and everything he encountered taught him something about God or about himself. One of the things that you've seen a couple of examples, but this is an explanation of it, is the schema monk. The schema, I'll show you a picture of it in a second, who's also a school of monastics, was very strict, where the monk would be hidden away from pretty much everyone. These monks wore a special garment they called the schema. The garment was embroidered with symbols of the passion, which the monks themselves sewed. And as you've seen pictures of this already, and you can see how they vary, it's up to the individual monk. I don't know an enormous amount about this. I think it's fascinating. I've seen, I've never met a schema monk, because you're not going to. They hide away. Yes, question?
I've actually have studied a bit about this sort of things. The thing is, basically, it starts at first. It's just when you first get the robe, it's first just a black robe or so. Then over time, you add the cross and everything, and the highest ranking monks or so, you get when you reach the highest rank, you get the hood, and you also get the image of the seraphim on it.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I've read a little about it. One of the things that I've never seen, that there are honestly questions that I have, is you really don't see an unfinished one, or maybe that on the left is unfinished, and you'll see more and more. So I know that it was possibly it came from the Desert Fathers, and what they would do is that they would, as you first entered into the monastic life, would have you'd begin working on this garment, and you'd sew it up, and you sewed your sins into it, you sewed your weaknesses into it, you sewed your prayers into it, and each symbol had some meaning and such, and they developed this over the years as they were in monastic life, and it became almost like a roadmap of where you came from, where you'd been, where you were going, and your strengths and weaknesses. I've even heard, and again, I don't know, a man could almost hear your confession just from your schema, because everything was sewn in of what you struggled with, and where your strengths and weaknesses were all sewn into the schema. So it really was a map of your soul in a sense. But again, I never met anybody, because you really don't meet them. They're very much locked away. You did see some examples of wanderers with schema, but I really think that's someone who's very much alone, going from a lonesome place to a lonesome place. It was much more hermetical. It was not a community-based thing, and came from the time of the Desert Fathers, but it was resurrected in Russia and really became a key and central part of their spirituality. Russian nuns. Russian nuns were certainly there. There were women going involved. They did not have the wandering spirituality. They were not the loners that the men were. They were mostly kept in community. One of the things you're going to see here, and you're going to see, we talk about Viking Christianity in a moment, is that one of the things about European Christianity is you go away to a monastery, you leave. You almost like leave your family. There were actually talks about that. When someone joined a monastery, you basically buried them. You would never see them again. They would actually, some of the more austere rites, you'd almost do like a funeral rite, and you basically lost whichever child was going to the monastery. You would never see them again. that was softened over time. With the northern with these Russia and with Scandinavia, you don't see that at all. In fact, the bond with the community remains very tight. The woman just goes off and begins living a pious life, but she may regularly see her family on the Sundays when she comes in. Later on, you'll see that she may almost never leave the house, but live this kind of a dedicated life. But Russian nuns will do this. They have a number of women who are consecrated to God and live, but they don't live the life of the wanderer the way the men do. You do have schema monks. Who's the lady on the left? You can see that the habit is different with the whole large hat and everything. I don't know much about that, quite honestly. They lived in communities. Communities were not nearly as remote as the men did. They were always in communities, and again, they were much more involved with. They did some teaching. They did a lot of liturgy, a lot of singing in the liturgy, and a lot of helping out the priests in the liturgy. But you certainly had women living the Christian life here. So yeah, singing liturgy is a big part of the Russian nun. Um, some of the most beautiful music, just really just ethereal music, are Russian nuns singing. It's unlike our Western music where you have a certain rhythm. Peter has some tapes of it, or some discs of it. It's like angels singing. It doesn't follow Western rhythms really at all. It's very interesting though. The Russian primate and the seraphim mitre. This is one of the unique things about Russia. Was you've seen the kind of crown things that most bishops wear. The Russian primate, the head of the Russian church, actually has a unique mitre with the seraphim symbol on it like this. No idea where it came from. No idea why it did it, but it's something that unique to the Russian church has had this seraphim mitre. Kind of neat. Liturgy is Byzantine, but Russia makes it her own. One of the things about Byzantine liturgy is they really assume that you have nothing else to do for the rest of the day, that you live in a remote area, but Byzantine liturgies are long. 2 to 3 hours is normal. Anything unusual, you're at 5 or 6. When you go to the Holy Week, you're there all day long. Really, actually, I've done this. I did this for a couple of years and helped. You stand the whole. There are no kneelers in in Byzantine worship at all. There are no kneelers. You stand the whole time. And oh my God, I used to have like knee and ankle problems. It's kind of funny. They actually have a thing where you do. It looks like a Muslim when you get down on your knees, touch your head to the ground, back up on your knees. I used to do that just to like not be standing anymore, but. The liturgy is beautiful. Russian liturgy is more stately and less dynamic than Greek liturgy is, but the music is incredible. But it looks very similar. Viking Christianity. The Vikings now shifting entirely what's the Monty Python, not for something completely different. The North adopted Christianity in a very different way. The Vikings were already a very communal people, a very organized people. And when they adopted Christianity, which was relatively quickly, people talk about the Vikings and the Great Heathen Army. It was 2 generations, really, between the first incursions and the 700s, and by 900 they already have most of the thing developing Christianity. One of the things that brought Viking Christianity in is very similar to what happened in Ireland, and that was that the bishops were obeyed by their inferiors. You honored and obeyed their bishops, and the Viking kings looked at that and said, I don't get that kind of obedience from my subordinates. How do I get it? And they're like, Christian kings are anointed of God and you owe them fealty. And they're like, all right, I'm on board. So much of what converted Viking Christianity is similar to what converted Ireland, and that was the respect and the structure and the obedience to superiors, which you didn't have in a lot of the pagan rivalries. Kind of funny, we'll talk about dynastic struggles next, so it wasn't all roses, but one of the big things you have were stave churches, a unique type of architecture that was typical of the North and the Viking area. Much of actually, I don't know for a fact this at all, but from what I've seen, I think a lot of what later on became Viking imagery were actually things that began ornaments on churches that were later even further adopted. But it's a unique type of church that is unlike anything in mainstream Europe or in the East. Stave churches are made of wood. Unlike churches in Southern Europe, which are mostly stone, these churches are tall and elegant, hearkening to the Gothic churches of the next century. You can see how tall these things are. The wood structures allow, and there were certainly were wood churches in Europe, don't get me wrong, but stone very quickly became very popular, partly because I think because it was warmer in Europe, and the stone, when the north it was colder, but, although I don't know that for a fact at all. But you can see how the architecture almost harkens to the Gothic, even though we're a long way from the Gothic. Well, not a long way, it's coming quickly, but we're not there yet. The floor plan of a stave church is also more like a temple than a basilica. One of the things about Christian architecture in Europe was when it first got started, the Christians did not want to use the pagan floor plans because they did not want to hearken to the pagans. And the pagan floor plan, which actually the Byzantines do still use, and actually the Anglicans will pick it up to a point, was you came in, there was a doorway, and you go into the temple, and only certain people could go in. And again, the Jews were like this. You had the priest court in the Holy of Holies, and many of the pagans had this as well. With the Christians, it was a matter of you came in and the clergy were up in the sanctuary, but there was a visibility. You did not have this inner sanctum and layers like this. They got rid of that initially, especially in Western Christianity. The Vikings would bring it back. They come into their churches were much more temple-like. You'd come in and you'd gather around and such. You did not have these long barrel churches and such. The layout, and part of the reason for that here, stave churches were more along the lines of Viking longhouses and basilicas. They built their churches closer to their longhouses. Now, longhouses were longhouses, and there were different sections in the longhouses, but they were communal places. They were not, you would come in there, and there were areas where you do certain things and such, but they built them along the lines of longhouse and basilica. I don't actually know, that sounds almost like a contradiction. The basilica were very segmented. I don't think these were nearly as much. It was much more brought together. The Vikings, unlike the Russians, did not personalize their religious expression. They mostly adopted Catholicism from the continent. There would be a significant difference, though. Northern religious life remained much more family-oriented, meaning that monasteries did not isolate themselves like they did in the south, in, say, Italy or France. They were much closer to towns and families. Benedictinism came in there and was really adopted whole cloth, partly because of the fact it was so communal. You ate together, you worked together. This was Viking already. Vikings ate together and worked together, so that Benedictine mentality fit right in to the Viking ethos. Religious life in Scandinavia was pretty common. And by common, I don't just mean common, I mean you would actually have the people working in the fields, the monks and the people working would work together. The monastery was not that separated. It was in an area of town. You're especially going to see, and I'll cover them more in a second here, with the Beguines and the people of the northern countries. You'd actually have, in fact, there's a famous English lady hermit, whose name is escaping me, who wrote a number of, Julian of Norwich, was in the town, in this little area. Very typically northern kind of thing here. The monks did not separate themselves where they did in say, France, Spain, and Italy. In the north here, they would mix with the people of the town quite frequently. Communal meals, communal work are very common here. Again, you'd have the living in community came naturally to the Vikings, and so when Benedictinism came in, that makes sense. We know just what that's like. Secular monastics, people who lived lives of religious orders, but in their own homes or in their local church. This was partly where Anglicanism gets out, this Anglican spirituality of the monastic tools being used by the people, actually praying along with, rather than having a separate monastic thing, comes from this. And again, you have in the northern countries, you have in Denmark, Scandinavia, it even comes down into like Holland and area, and then again into England. You have this close connection between those who live dedicated lives and those who work. And again, the idea that someone would, before they went to work, would go in and would to the church and would hear morning prayer, would go off to work, would work for a while, come back in the evening and join, and they would see, and they would have those members of their family who were dedicated to whatever else, and they would have lots of communication, unlike, again, in Europe and such, where you have the person going away and leaving the family. They don't leave the family at all. In fact, the family is very much pulled into this life of the person who's dedicated to God. Dynastic struggles. Rival kings against the great heathen army. If there was a dark age in Europe, the 900s was it. The kings were Christian, but often there was dynastic rivalry and a desire to have kingdoms consolidate and unite, plus contending with the great heathen army. This led to struggles, betrayal, and sometimes murder. Coming outside of the religious life here and talking about these kings and the political scene right now, again, there's a desire, it is a entirely normal desire for the kingdoms to have a central rule. You're stronger with a central ruler as opposed to these fractioned kingdoms. But again, each king is going to, no king really wants to put down their crown and become a vassal of somebody else. And so there are struggles of, who's going to do this. That also with the fact, as we looked at last time, was Danelaw, was the great heathen army, the Vikings coming in, establishing in England, in northern France, coming in there. So there's a need to get together to fight the strength to confront the army. But at the same time, which king is going to lead? And you had betrayals and problems. Dynasties sought to remain in power, sometimes even with children as king. One of the shameful aspects of this is that when you had, say, the father was dead, it was only a young boy, they would say, oh, okay, he's passed away. Let's go ahead and unite under King whosoever over here, and I'll be a vassal. No, we're the royal family. Put the crown on a little boy, and we're going to hang on to our dynasty. So there was a lot of squabbles and struggles over which royal family was going to remain in power. Edwig, eldest son of Edmund I. I'm kind of jumping into the 900s, and I've also chosen this group because it shows you what was going on. It also bleeds into the year 1000, but this really gives you a sense of kind of what was going on here. The eldest son of Edmund I. Edward was about 16 when he was crowned at the Kingston upon Thames in southeast London. Legend had it his coronation had to be delayed to allow Bishop Dunstan to prise Edwig from his bed and between the arms of his strumpet's mother. Perhaps unimpressed by the interruption, Edwig had Dunstan exiled to France. Edwig died in Gloucester when he was just 20. The circumstances of his death are not recorded. You get a sense of the flavor of what's going on. The youngest son of Edmund I, Edgar, had been in dispute with his brother concerning the succession to the throne for some years. Following Edwig's mysterious death, Edgar immediately recalled Dunstan from exile, making him Archbishop of Canterbury, as well as his personal advisor. Following his carefully planned by Dunstan coronation in Bath at 973, Edgar marched his army to Chester to be met by the 6 kings of Britain. The kings included the King of the Scots, the King of Strathclyde, and various princes of Wales are said to have signaled their allegiance to Edgar by rowing him to the state barge across the River Dee. Edward the Martyr. Eldest son of Edgar, Edward was crowned king when he was just 12. Although supported by Archbishop Dunstan, his claim to the throne was contested by supporters of his much younger half-brother Ethelred. The resulting dispute between rival factions within the church and the nobility almost led to a civil war in England. Edward's short reign ended when he was murdered at Corfe Castle by followers of Ethelred after just 2.5 years as king. The title martyr was a consequence of him being seen as a victim of his stepmother's ambition for her own son, Ethelred. Ethelred the Unready. I'll talk about this name in a second here. Ethelred was unable to organize resistance against the Danes, earning him the name Unready or badly advised. He became king about 10, but fled to Normandy in 1013 when Svein Forkbeard, king of the Danes, invaded England in an act of revenge following the St. Brice's Day massacre of England's Danish inhabitants. Svein was pronounced King of England on Christmas Day in 1013 and made his capital at Gainsborough, Lincolnshire. He died just 5 weeks later. Ethelred returned in 1014 after Svein's death. The remainder of Ethelred's reign was one of constant state of war with Svein's son, Canute. As you can see, I've pushed a little bit into the year 1000 here. Ethelred the Unready, this was a kind of an unfair thing. It had to do with unadvised. Basically, he ruled alone. He didn't have any counselors, possibly because he wasn't reliable, possibly because there was no one there, possibly because he chose to. We don't really know. But the unready had more to do with the badly advised, or literally unadvised, and had more to do historically with the fact that he didn't have any right-hand man. He ruled almost like many centuries later, Louis XIV, who had no prime minister. He ruled all by himself. Ethelred ruled all by himself. And again, there were mistakes made, although unready and badly advised are possibly modern readings of the idea that he had no prime minister. Edmund Ironside. We're a little bit into the next century, but this is kind of the end of this chapter here. Son of Ethelred II, Edmund had led the resistance to Canute's invasion of England in 1015. Following the death of his father, he was chosen king by the good folk of London. The Witan, or King's Council, however, elected Canute. Following his defeat at the Battle of Essendon, Edmund made a pact with Canute to divide the kingdom between them. This treaty ceded control of all of England with the exception of Wessex to Canute. It also stated that when one of the kings died, the other would take all of England. Edmund died later that year, probably assassinated, and this leads into the Dane Law, which is where you have the Scandinavian people controlling a good portion of what is eastern England. Before I jump into this here, you can see the struggles they have with the dynasties here and such, trying to regulate England here, and that really is it goes to show kind of the social dynamism and such. The same thing happens in France. I'm not covering France for the sake of time, but the same thing was happening in France with the Capetians to the Carolingians, from the Carolingians into the Plantagenets. But that's a little bit later. I might touch on that. This idea of trying to coalesce and to keep strong royal families in line is something that you're going to see all the history of Europe here. So I'm going to begin this last section with saying this really more approach to the year 1000, but the year 1000 there's just so much going on that I'm going to begin a little bit of this now. As Europe was becoming more and more Christian, there was a movement to shore up religious practice and discipline. Monasticism was a central institution in the Christianization of society, and a number of reform-minded monks sought to establish a standard of order, liturgy, and discipline that would allow monastic houses to adopt a program to create a reliable and lasting reform. Monastic life had declined to a low ebb in England by the 9th century, partly because of the ravages caused by Viking attacks, and partly because of the wealth of many monasteries, partly because the monasteries were seen by many to be more comfortable places where men went to live out their Christian lives or retire, often as older men and women, in peace and comfort. Going and retiring to a monastery when your children had grown had become very, very popular. Many key figures in the area became advocates for monastic reform, from abbots to kings. You also had the fact that really oftentimes they were held onto by larger families. It became the place where you sent your kids would often go off, or your second son would just become an abbot of a monastery. They became owned by some of the larger noble houses. These reformers wanted monasteries to be spiritual sinners they once were. Often smaller movements sought to improve monastic life. One of them stood out and was the most successful, the French Abbey of Cluny. This begins a major chapter in what would become the High Middle Ages, and some of the most amusing stories, I'll tell them next time, of when Cluny begins and then the reforms that Cluny inspires. Cluny was a cooperation between Duke William of Aquitaine and Abbot Benedict of Aniane. Cluny established a program which gave each house less autonomy gave less time in each house and to monitor discipline more centrally. Traditionally, Benedictine houses were mostly autonomous, often answering only to the Pope. The head of Cluny became the head of all monasteries associated with the reform, which meant that abuses could be addressed and corrected. And this was a huge help in preserving monastic discipline and avoiding such problems as landholding and wealth. When a monastery joined the Cluniac family, they were assumed to adopt their reforms. It became, what's my next slide? Am I just with the pictures? Yeah, I'm with the pictures at this point. So one of the things that there's a number of slides that I pared this down a little bit so I could talk about it rather than showing it. You had was landholding. And this doesn't go away with Cluny, don't get me wrong, and I'll go into this next time. But oftentimes serfs wanted to be the landholder of a monastery. First of all, the taxes were generally lower. And second of all, the son didn't have to go to war with the local lord, whose vassal he was. And so monasteries became huge landholders. And this meant that the monks didn't have to go out and work the fields, which was very traditionally Benedictine. They stayed, they copied, they sang liturgies, which became very, very elaborate. And again, the life became much softer and much simpler. There was food there, so they were dining relatively well. And again, it also became a place where nobles or people with money, although not necessarily even common men, good Christian men, could retire to a monastery and have a nice, comfortable cell and what have you, and almost up their standard of living in some ways by retiring to a monastery rather than being in their little farmhouse. So it became kind of retirement communities, and it became places where the second son of Duke Husso, it's like St. Thomas Aquinas, the famous theologian from a couple centuries from now, his family was very well off, and he could have basically become the abbot of Monte Cassino or someplace just by virtue of his nobility. It was not uncommon at all. So the Cluniac reform, which will take off, and we will go into this next time on just how big this becomes, what a juggernaut of religious reform, and then the breakdowns which will spring. The idea of discipline and reform, and you can see we're back to the West here. You don't have the gaudy, you don't have the paint. You have stone. You have much simpler things. Even the habits of the monks and everything. The organized and disciplined life of the monasteries. We tried to get back to this simplicity, and Cluny was the first one to do it. Now, the white habits, that's Citeaux, and we'll cover that next time. I couldn't find any good pictures of traditional Benedictines. But the idea was the same thing, the idea of getting back to people who are dedicated to God and not just retirees and not just sons of nobility, to get back to a more regular life. All right, next time. The year 1000, the first millennium. I'm limiting myself to 2 topics because there's just so much. I'm going to talk about the monastic revival in full force. Cluny, followed by Citeaux, followed by the Chartreuse. And next week, when I teach this next time, I'll actually have a book from the Chartreuse when I was there that I'm in it. I will pass that around. So this really is the great monastic reform, and the fights that go on this thing are absolutely hysterical. They really do. They fight this out about what's the correct way to do this. Cluny becomes this huge juggernaut, and Citeaux comes up against them, and then Chartreuse is kind of a side thing. Followed by the Crusades, in the beginning of the chapter of the Crusades, and I'm going to go into that to some extent here. There's a lot to cover. I will wait till the 1100s to cover some of the other domestic things that are going on here. So the next time I'm going to cover is going to be the monastic revival, which, because I spent a lot of time there, I know a lot about. You're going to get probably more information than you want to. And again, the arrival of the Crusades. Any questions?
I'm sorry, what's the next class?
That's a really good question. Probably, so we're on probably September, probably the first Sunday of September. I'll put it up in the Monday email to let you know when it is, but it's probably going to be the first. I like to do it the first Sundays. Sometimes I can't. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for your.
Here's a collection